leading Britain's conversation with David Lammy.
Scandal after scandal. And now it's time to just pause and reflect on this most awful of scandals, the infected blood scandal. Children used as guinea pigs and lab rats. The true scale of the number of medical trials that used infected blood products on children in the 1970s and 80s, frankly, is only now being laid bare by the inquiry that's going on. It reveals a secret world of unsafe clinical testing involving children in the UK as doctors effectively placed research goals ahead of the needs of patients. It continued for more than 15 years. It involved hundreds of people and infected so many of them with hepatitis C, HIV, and a whole number of other disorders. Many of these people had blood clotting disorders. There'll be people listening who have blood clotting disorders. And they needed transfusions. They needed plasma to assist them. Many who were infected during this period in the 1970s and 80s have now died. Documents also show that doctors in haemophilia centres across the country used blood products even though they were widely known to be contaminated. A shortage of blood products in the UK in the 1970s and 80s meant that they were imported from the United States. And, of course, the problem with the importing them from the from the United States is that high-risk donors, such as prisoners and drug addicts, had provided the plasma for the treatments that infected these people. And so fatal viruses were passed on: hepatitis C, which attacks the liver, resulting in cirrhosis and cancer, and HIV, which, of course, led to many contracting the AIDS virus. One blood product known as factor VIII was seen to be highly effective from stopping bleeding, but of course it was widely known to be contaminated with these viruses. A public inquiry is underway as we speak. It's largely under the way because of the campaigning of these families over many, many years. And let me pay tribute to my dear colleague and friend, Dame Diana Johnson, who has done so much in Parliament to raise these issues, get this issue heard. And I pay tribute to her and the work of so many families over so many years. The campaign that's kicking off today, and it's in the Sunday Times, is calling for a lump sum payment and ongoing support for the infected victims. It's calling for bereaved parents and children to be eligible for compensation. It's calling for compensation to be paid now by a judge-led independent body and an official apology. Why? Why are we always calling for compensation? Proper compensation for the post office scandal victims. Proper compensation for the Windrush victims. Proper compensation and support for the Grenfell victims. And this scandal, which goes back longer than those scandals, and still no compensation that's adequate for these families that are suffering. My God, what a scandal. What an outrage. If you've been affected by this scandal, please call me. How difficult has it been for you to get the justice that you deserve? And why does this same thing keep happening scandal after scandal. The post office scandal, the Windrush scandal, and now the infected blood scandal, to name but a few. What is it in our country that means that we just cannot treat ordinary people properly? I have to say, it just shocks me when you hear the stories behind this, because it involves babies, a lot of young people particularly, who are affected. In the 1970s and 80s, about 1,250 people were affected with HIV after receiving contaminated blood. It included 380 children. Hemophilia is a really difficult disorder to be struggling with. It's hard enough as it is, but then to be in this situation is just so utterly awful. I'm joined by Rosemary from Northampton. Rosemary, who's called in. Rosemary, help us understand this. Explain who you are and what your story is.
Oh, good morning, David. Yes, my name is Rosemary, and I had a son, Nicky, who was born in 1974. When he was about 9 months old, he was diagnosed as having haemophilia. No history of it in the family, so, that came as quite a shock to start with. But over the years, we learned how to manage it. He was originally on a much safer product for 3 years to treat his bleeding episodes. When he got to about 3 years old, I was advised by the medical staff that they had a wonderful new treatment, Factor 8, which would make life much simpler for us, that it was more pure than what he'd been receiving, and that I could also go on to learn how to administer it myself so that he could be on home treatment, which is what we did. So,
where were you living at the time, Rosemary?
I was living in London at the time.
Right, yeah.
So Nicky went on to home treatment, and in the 80s, 82, 83, we started seeing reports in the newspapers about the new disease that they'd identified at the time as HTLV3, which is now known as HIV. And somewhere down the article that I was reading, I read that haemophiliacs could also be infected with this as a result of their treatment. I was advised by everybody I spoke to that the risk was absolutely minimal, that I should continue treating him as I'd always done. At the time, he was on a prophylactic treatment, which was 3 injections a week to try and prevent bleeding episodes, which I immediately took him off of and only gave it to him on demand. Didn't go down very well with the hospital, but it was my decision. When Nicky was 11 in 1985, a couple of days before he was due to start high school, I received a letter in the post from his haematologist to say that they tested his blood and he tested positive for HIV. We were given no support.
Rosemary, let me just pause there because, it's very emotional. Tears are coming to my eyes as you tell this story. I remember this period very vividly. Your son was born 2 years after I was born.
Right.
I remember that early period in the 1980s. There was a huge alarm and panic, really, across the world and certainly across our media about the HIV virus. I think many look back now and regret some of what that was said. But when you received that letter, you had been reassured and you had gone on to provide the product. I can't get my head around what you must have felt at that time.
Well, it was just like the bottom fell out of our world because we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know what his life expectancy would be. Also, the knowledge that I had, in all likelihood, injected that virus into his veins because he was on home treatment and I was administering his injections. It was a terrible time. The adverts on the TV, the tombstone adverts, it was one of the darkest times in our lives. Yes. And all the time we were told we mustn't tell anybody. We mustn't share it with anybody because there were such terrible repercussions.
Oh, you mean you mustn't tell anyone that he had HIV? You must keep it quiet and secret.
Yes, we had to keep it quiet because in case there was any repercussions from it. I mean, I do know families. I run a support group for bereaved parents through the infected blood, and some of them have horrendous stories to tell. That when people found out, they had to move from their homes, they lost their jobs. So this was something that my husband and we had to keep to ourselves. We couldn't share it with anybody else. We were getting no support from the hospital or any of the doctors. So we were totally isolated with it. And then there were reports in the papers about, wanting to gather them all up and put them in institutions so that they wouldn't be a threat to anybody else. And we couldn't tell Nicky at 11 years old, with all this mass hysteria going on in the papers and on the television. How do you tell an 11-year-old child that, he is carrying this virus? So we didn't tell him until he was about 14 or 15.
And how did you tell him? I mean, how did he take it?
Well, Nicky being Nicky, thankfully, was very laid back and easygoing and took it in his stride, the way he'd always taken everything else in his stride, his haemophilia. He didn't let it get the better of him. He didn't let it beat him. But eventually, in his early 20s, he began to succumb to the viruses. When he was 15 or 16, we were also told that he'd been infected with hepatitis C as well.
Oh.
And so, he started to become unwell.
Effectively, Rosemary, a drug addict or a prisoner in the United States who had given blood transfusions and had made its way to Nicky. You had injected it into him without your knowledge, and here he was. Did he decline then in his early 20s?
He did, yes. And Nicky died on the 20th of December 1999, and he was 25. He left a widow and a 1-year-old son who's never known his father. During the course of the inquiry, we've now learned that this was also unnecessary. This was also avoidable. They knew the risks, but they chose to ignore them. They purchased inferior products because it was cheaper and didn't give any thought to the welfare of patients that they were administering them to. And so many children, Nicky was 9 when he was infected. And all these children infected with these terrible life-threatening viruses, and out of 1,250 haemophiliacs, there are less than 200 now still alive.
Rosemary, no amount of money can bring Nicky back. No amount of money, I imagine, can ever meet his son that's gone without a father, his wife that's gone without a husband. But the campaign today is calling for lump sum payments and ongoing support for infected victims. Mm-hmm. It is calling for bereaved parents and children to be made eligible for compensation. It's calling for a judge-led independent body to pay out that compensation. I imagine learning from the huge problems that the Windrush scandal victims have had, and an official apology just in your words, what sort of compensation have you had? And I imagine that it's been totally inadequate for the pain and suffering that you and your entire family have experienced.
Nick's family, actually it's my ex-husband now, because as a result of Nicky's loss, our marriage fell apart. None of us have ever received a penny in compensation. And as you say, there's not enough money in the world can compensate for the loss of a child.
Yeah.
But there's got to be some kind of form of contrition from those responsible and those in power. And how much longer have we got to wait? Because all the time people are dying. 2 people still dying every week. Those that are infected, they lost their livelihoods, they lost any source of income, they've had to live on handouts and benefits for all these years. And also, parents were affected also. They were financially impacted. My marriage broke down. I had to start again. We both had to start again. Families had to leave their home and move where they weren't known. People lost their jobs. So there's been a huge financial impact on families. And so we do need some kind of recognition, and we also need recognition of what we experienced, of having to live with that stigma and the knowledge that we were probably going to lose our children. And then we had to nurse them through their sickness, and we watched them die.
Rosemary, thank you for your courage and your bravery for coming on this morning. I'm hugely, hugely grateful. We're talking about the infected blood scandal. If you're listening, please call me if you've experienced this huge injustice and explain just why it's the injustice it is without the compensation and the support and the apology that you've been entitled to over my entire lifetime. Unbelievable. How can Post Office scandal, Windrush scandal, Grenfell, scandals that have come Hillsborough since that period, expect justice when old scandals like this that have been around for such a long time are still waiting for justice? Lucas has texted and he said the answer is because there's no accountability and no due process being followed. That's why these scandals keep happening, regardless of which public department. Andrew calling in from Worcester. Andrew, thank you so much for calling in.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for having me on. It's really good to speak to you.
Not at all.
I'm somebody impacted by the infected blood scandal. I'm a haemophiliac, and I was infected with HIV and hepatitis C at the age of 5 in 1983 that I was infected. 1977 I was born. I wasn't told by my parents were told when I was about 10, but they didn't tell me until I was about 13. And that was because my blood results had started to show that I was becoming susceptible to the HIV. And so they started me on the first drug that was available at that time, which was AZT. And AZT was an awful, awful drug, and they used it in such high doses. I was on the way to school in the morning and I was being sick on the coach, and, I couldn't tell anybody why that was happening. My parents told me when I was 13 and I started to develop, full-blown AIDS when I was 16. And I was in hospital from the ages of 16 to 20 before there were any decent, effective drugs available. And during that time, my parents were told several times, look, be prepared. The next infection will probably be the last one. Your son's going to die. Luckily, somehow.
Andrew, what was it like? Were you keeping this all secret at the time?
Yeah, I told my one best friend, and he was brilliant. He was amazing. But he couldn't tell anybody, so he had to kind of suffer along with me. And of course, when I had full-blown AIDS, I just had to disappear. There was no trace of me at school. And then I learned later on that my headmaster had stood up in an assembly and told people why I wasn't there. that I had AIDS and I wasn't likely to make it. So, of course, then everybody in my school knew about it.
Were you able to go back to that school?
Well, I was ill, really, dying until the age of 20. So it was all behind me at that point. But obviously, I've seen people since then, and the comments. Some of them haven't been very nice, but in the main, people have been very supportive of me. But of course, 16 to 20, those are your formative years, and so when I came out of the AIDS period, I was lost in the world mentally. I'd had all the physical injuries that the AIDS had caused, including lung conditions, and I'd had a stroke, and all of that sort of thing.
Andrew, you're still with us. God bless. I mean,
absolutely.
What was it? Did the drugs improved? I know the HIV drugs improved.
They did. I mean, the early drugs, while very effective, the combination therapies, what they called the highly active antiretroviral therapy, or HAART, were very effective in suppressing the HIV, but of course they came along with their own side effects. So it was a long time before I started to become what I would call, reasonably well. But during that time, I was in touch with other people who had gone through this. And so in 2006, I decided to start to look for answers as to why this had all happened. And I set up the campaign group Tainted Blood. And so with another guy called Gareth Lewis, who had a history of campaigning on the subject. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2010. But since then, we've struggled. We've struggled so hard fighting against the government line, the line that said.
Andrew, how much compensation have you had?
In the 21 interim report, 2021 interim report of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff recommended that people who were infected and their bereaved spouses were entitled to an interim payment of £100,000. So that's
40 years later.
40 years later, yeah. So that's interim. That's a precursor to what we hope will come in a wider compensation package after the inquiry concludes. That's what we've been told by the Paymaster General, that will be coming. But of course, since the inquiry was first launched, 680 people have died without that justice and that compensation. We're a ticking clock. We're losing, as Rosemary said quite rightly, Rosemary's devastating story, that we're losing 2 people a week at the moment. Out of the people that are infected, 1,248.
What about your parents? How have your parents fared? Sorry.
My dad really took it upon himself to look after me during that time. Unfortunately, he's passed away in 2003. But so my mum's been left on her own to kind of cope with all of this aftermath. And same as Rosemary, she obviously was doing the home treatment, and she may have injected me with the virus herself, which carries huge guilt. Luckily, I was doing it myself as well at the time, at the age of 5. I was doing my own injections, so there's a hope that maybe it was me that did it rather than her. But yeah, and talking of guilt, the survivor's guilt, I've managed to make it. I've beaten the odds to make it this far. For how much longer, I don't know. But, why me? Why have I survived? Why have the people that are still left to fight still here and others aren't? It's such a horrendous scandal that keeps taking lives even 40 years later.
Andrew, thank you for calling in. Thank you for your courage. Chairman of the campaign group Tainted Blood there, calling in. Michael says thalidomide, infected blood, Windrush, Grenfell, Post Office and others, one thing in common: delay after delay in paying compensation and issuing apologies. It's as if enough time elapses and many of the claimants have passed away. It seems to me that a break is always applied on proceedings as a matter of course. What a scandal. And that's Michael. We're talking about the infected blood scandal. Please call me. I haven't done this in the many years that I presenting LBC, so it was really important to do this. My colleague Diana Johnson's done so much in the House of Commons to bring this to light. Cross-party, of course. I obviously, Windrush, Grenfell, so I really, really care about these injustices. George, calling in from Medway. George, thank you for calling in.
Thank you very much for taking my call, David. David, next time you go to the House of Commons and you're sitting on the benches and you're looking around, just remember that since the start of this inquiry, 680 people have died. That's equivalent to the whole House of Commons.
Yes. Yes.
Also, what I would say, David, is if, God forbid it, Russia attacked the UK and killed 4,800 of our people, there'd be total outcry.
There would be.
But, David, I say to you that the British government poisoned 4,800 people in the UK and turned a blind eye, and no one cares. We've fought, David.
George, just to pause there, this of course happened after the thalidomide scandal. You'd have thought we would have known.
We did. We knew the risks. The World Health Organisation told the UK government many times not to do this, not to use blood imported from high-risk places like America. My dad was infected with HIV.
When was he infected, do we think? When was he infected, George?
My dad was infected in 1983, I believe. He wasn't informed. My dad was a very mild haemophiliac. He didn't need treatment. He never needed treatment. He had to go down to his hematology place for his regular blood tests to make sure that his blood clotting factor was okay. And he had a bit of a bump on his thumb. He didn't need treatment, but they wound him down. Said, "Look, it's just one injection. It's one injection." And that one injection infected him with HIV, with hepatitis C, and with variant CJD. He had two other brothers, and they was infected with different viruses. And then the doctors, the government...
Sorry, George. Your dad was infected with those viruses. Did you say he had other brothers who were infected?
Yes. So when you have haemophilia, it normally runs in the family of men.
Yes, I see. Yes.
So they cherry picked. It sounds, when we first started this campaign, and I used to sort of tell people thought he was mad. The government would never do anything like this. So it's one thing dying for your country, as in you go to war, but dying because of your country is something completely different, let me tell you. The guy you were just talking to, Andrew, was very right. So we couldn't tell people. I can tell you that my mum's just been diagnosed with bowel cancer, and that is horrendous. I can tell you that. It's very sad. I can share that news with you. I couldn't share with you at the time that my dad was infected with the most deadly diseases on this planet. Do you know, can I just say one more thing, David? I'm sure, like most other people, you had your COVID injection. Yes. What on earth would you do in 5 years' time if someone said to you, sorry, that COVID injection carried the HIV virus, but you can't tell no one, you've got to be quiet. And then that's why they put these adverts on TV, don't die of AIDS. They put them on TV, we believe, to scare the Hemophilia community into not saying nothing.
George, what does justice look like to you?
So what I would like would never happen. I would like people to go to prison. The way that, I can't think of his name, the father of the House of Commons.
George, you know, can I just say there...
I would like people to go to
what
prison.
you just said is reasonable. After the Grenfell Tower controversy, I think, well, it wasn't a controversy. It was horrific. The place burned to the ground. I said the next morning on radio that I believe that this was gross negligence manslaughter. That's what you're effectively saying. The law does exist, but no one's gone to prison.
No. So when Kenneth Clark stood up, slouched, I tell you, at the inquiry chair and said, I don't know why we're bothering doing this. How can you make decisions for people's lives when you know nothing about the disease or the condition or whatever? He thought hemophilia was something you treat with a tablet. He made life-changing decisions about...
This is his health secretary at the time.
He was a health secretary at the time, yes. Yeah. And I firmly believe he has blood on his hands. And, of course, it would never happen because there's such a ring around Parliament that if I wanted to speak to X, Y and Z, I've got to jump through so many hoops to get there. This isn't a free country.
George, I'm reliably told, by the way, that politicians in France have gone to prison for this.
They certainly did. And I believe in Japan, I believe, some of them got prosecuted for it. But over in this country, because there's a Pandora's box over there that says do not touch, because if you touch this, your political career will disintegrate in seconds. This is why it's been pushed under the carpet and into the political minefield. We have become... Over all the years I've been campaigning, we have become a political football, and having piecemeal ex gratia payments here and there. My dad, unfortunately, as I said, passed away at the start of this inquiry, and that is very, very, very hard to cope with. But I haven't got my dad next to me, so when I go up to the inquiry, when I go up to hear the response from the inquiry, which I will do, I'll have an empty chair next to me. And when I have an empty chair next to me, there should be my dad sitting in there.
George, thank you for calling in. Thank you for sharing. God bless you. Best of luck to you and your family. Sandra in Sheffield. Sandra.
Hello, David.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Sandra.
I wasn't... our mother contracted hepatitis C in the 80s. She went into hospital for a routine gallbladder operation and had to have a blood transfusion. And it was just from start to finish, just one big cover-up. They just kept saying she'd been to a tropical country and contracted something. In fact, the only place she'd been abroad was Austria, and didn't have any accidents, no cuts, or, didn't have to have any blood or anything. And, it was just one big cover-up from start to finish. My brother and I have been in touch. We've had meetings with the infected blood team. They came to our house, and we've given statements, and but it's just an absolute scandal. That
how, in terms of your mother, once she'd contracted hepatitis C, what were the effects on her?
Okay, they ended up sending her home from hospital, and she did have daily visits from her GP. And slowly, her lungs were filling up with fluid, and she had to have daily extractions of fluid from her lungs. They put her on steroids, and she just ballooned, absolutely ballooned. Her liver started giving up, so her skin and her eyes went yellow. She never drank, never smoked. She did yoga, keep fit. She looked after herself. She wasn't overweight. And it probably from start to finish about 6 months. And we never really had anybody say to us, this is what it was, until it came to light that we knew she'd had a blood transfusion because they asked my father's permission. And that's the only way we found out.
There's the campaign that's begun for proper compensation, proper apologies, basically for justice. What does that mean to you?
A campaign doesn't really do it. We need the government to actually admit what happened. No, like you've said previously, all these other scandals, they just get covered up.
Sandra, I can tell you now, there are, doughty campaigners in this movement for justice, and colleagues like my colleague Diana Johnson and others in the House of Commons who are determined they won't let this go. Thank you so much for calling in. I've got a text message here from Michelle who says, morning, David. I lost my 24-year-old brother in 1995 to the contaminated blood scandal after he was infected with HIV and hepatitis C. With the stigma around at the time and the secrecy we had to live with this for so long, it really affected myself and my parents after decades of being treated so poorly by successive governments. This business of stigma is really important. It came up, of course, during the post office scandal as well, but I think it's why this scandal is one of the longest running ones. Because, of course, if you think back to the way people were treated who had HIV and the public campaign of horror that was run across the tabloid newspapers and indeed by government campaigns at the time, people were keeping quiet, they were keeping this within them. But my God, the amount of stress that leads to, the amount of illness that keeping quiet in that way leads to in families. This is not just about justice for those that contaminated with the infected blood, but bereaved parents and children and families affected. My God, they should be eligible for compensation as well. Hugely emotional hour talking about the infected blood scandal and asking those affected to call in and asking the same question, why, oh why, after the post office scandal, the Windrush Grenfell, the Grenfell scandal, infected blood scandal, does this keep happening over Hillsborough, over and over and over again? Justice, the fight for justice in this country goes on and on and on and on. Simon, calling in from Haywards Heath.
Good morning, David. Thanks for taking my call.
Not at all, Simon. Thank you for calling.
I believe the NHS were responsible for killing my father through negligence, but this is all entwined into the blood scandal. In the mid-70s, I was only 9 or 8 or 9 or 10, around there. So this is a distant memory, but I certainly endured quite a lot of pain during that time and since, through watching my father, someone in his late 30s at the time, deteriorate very quickly. He had an operation for his knees, a cartilage, which should have been quite straightforward, but they needed extra blood at the time, quite a lot of it. So nothing was thought of that until he presented symptoms a year or so later, and he had severe anxiety and depression. Now, this is in context of a business person, a successful businessman, going about his way in his late 30s, who suddenly then deteriorates and becomes anxious and depressed and unable to function. He had neurology tests. He had all sorts of tests. It was only in 1979, upon his death, that the post-mortem revealed that he died from non-hepatitis A or B. Now, hepatitis C, I think, was quite an undiscovered situation at that stage, or newly discovered. I think it was sort of post-75 they started to uncover it. It obviously wasn't obvious to the medical profession. And the reason I say the NHS killed my father, and that's quite a strong statement, is that the tablets they were treating him with had a liver warning. They actually had a liver warning on the tablets. So, sorry.
Simon, I can feel this is very emotional for you, and it's... Simon, are you still there?
I am. Sorry.
No, I totally understand.
I'm usually pretty good at this stuff.
I totally understand, Simon. But Simon, the strength of your emotion and the loss of your father, and we can all feel it listening to you, conveys, and this is years and years and years later, conveys why you deserve some compensation for what you've experienced in your family. I mean, it can't bring your father back. It can't meet the wounds. Of course it can't, but it's what you're owed, isn't it?
Well, if it's proven and if that's the case, then yes, I'm all for justice. But
you've got one of those murky cases where you say it's not entirely clear. You feel there was a cover-up. People didn't know what happened. How did your fit father suddenly become a depressive? What was the context of the hepatitis that killed him? It's those questions that niggle at you probably on a daily basis.
There's lots to unravel, and I'm a busy person, so life carries on, doesn't it? Yes. And therefore these things don't come about. So when I saw this scandal sort of unfolding, I just put two and two together and made a lot more, hopefully, to try and get some answers.
Yeah.
But let's see.
Yeah.
I'm sure this won't be the only scandal that we face in the foreseeable future.
Simon, thank you for calling in. All power to you. Andrea in Farnborough. Andrea.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me on.
Hi.
So I'm a child. I'm not a child now, but I was a child when we lost my dad. He was infected with HIV and hepatitis. He was a haemophiliac and contracted it through blood products. I was 11 years old when my dad passed away. And as a result, my family, my nan, they never told myself or my sister what he passed away from. We were told it was pneumonia. And on his death certificate, it does say it says acquired immune deficiency syndrome, but secondary pneumonia because he had no immune system. And my nan made that decision because of the stigma and the discrimination and everything that came with these viruses in the 80s, like you said, the adverts and things like that. I remember he died at home the day after Boxing Day on our sofa. I'm 42 now, but I remember what he was wearing. For a child, it's a big impact to lose a parent. We'd already, my mum and dad are divorced 3 years earlier. Again, we just thought it's a divorce, but in later life, we've now found out it was because of what my dad contracted. So even though he was a fantastic dad, I'm led to believe that the stress on the marriage and
all of it,
not being all of it caused the breakdown in the marriage.
I assume you're following the inquiry and you hope that you'll get some justice, Andrea.
Oh my goodness, 100%. It's what I find it disgusting that everybody who's been infected and affected has had to wait this long anyway. But coming from the position of being children of somebody who was infected, to date we haven't had any compensation at all because the current schemes were set up for those infected.
I know this story. It shuts out families. It's the same story as Windrush. It's the same story as the post office scandal, and it's an outrage. Andrea, I'm just going to go to Daniel very quickly. Daniel calling in. Daniel?
Yes, hello there.
Daniel,
thanks for having me on.
Tell me your story very quickly before I go to the break.
Well, what it is, the point I'm trying to make is about the cover-ups and the shutdowns when the general public need answers.
Yes.
I've needed answers for 3 years in September since the death of my wife. And coincidentally, it would have been my 47th wedding anniversary tomorrow.
Oh, Daniel.
I'm waiting now 3 years for some kind of explanation. I'm fighting for compensation or money or retribution. I needed closure. I just needed someone to say, yes, we did this, it didn't work, we made a mistake. But all I've had is lies. In Birmingham, surgeon who did it were the most nastiest team of medics I've ever met. Granted, my wife did have health problems, but you expect the NHS them right when they say, yes, we can do this. I do it all the time. We will put your wife back second to none. And all I've met with is
It's stonewalling.
Closure and shut down. Yeah. I've even tried to get solicitors on the case. They've looked at it. They said, yes, we can take this on a no-win, no-fee. And then, lo and behold, we can't pursue your case anymore. No explanation, no nothing.
Daniel, it's a powerful way to end. The fight for justice for those infected by blood goes on and is taken up today in the Times, pursued across the House of Commons. We've got the inquiry reporting very, very shortly. Hugely, hugely important. Thank you so much for all of your calls in this last hour. We will fight for justice. Thank you for all your heartfelt contributions in that hour.